Hey, folkies, how you all going? I'm back again. I'm talking this time about policing victims of crime. So we've talked about victims of crime, we've defined what a victim of crime is. Now we're talking about what the policing issues are. And we're going to skip through these. Now, this is not everything, right? This is probably just some key points which influence how policing relationships happen with victims. So all of this stuff between police and victims makes a big difference to how victims experience policing processes, about how police experience different types of victims, and about the ways that they learn to manage the processes, because it can often be a process of managing expectations around the person who's been victimised, as well as the victim managing the processes around police officers and how they happen. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about now. Are these key broad ideas that influence the ways that policing and victimisation happen. One of the biggest issues that we come across in the research literature is that sometimes police don't believe the victims, for whatever reason that might be. And that's not necessarily just police. We have quite a bit of research now with other forms of criminal justice practitioners, including jurors, prosecutors, and so forth, where it's very clear that they have certain ideas about what a victim looks like, how a victim should behave, and if that victim is not aligning with those stereotypes, they're less likely to be believed by those people. So it's not just at police, it's sort of at every level of the criminal justice systems, really. So there's circumstances where a victim comes forward and they just don't report. It's a very common circumstance with rape and sexual assault victims, and this is actually one of the areas that they've done most of the research around this. Because police often privilege physical evidence over psychological evidence. But again, it's not just police, it's also prosecutions, and I understand they are police, but ultimately they make the decision about whether or not the case goes forward and all of that sort of stuff. And if a case comes across their desk where they just don't have much physical evidence at all, now, it's really hard for these folks to make these decisions a lot of the time, and they make it for the best interests of the victim, of the system, and all of those types of things when they make them, because oftentimes they need to think, number one, do we have a lot of physical evidence so it demonstrates that, as horrible as it is, if there's been a lot of violence, it's a better circumstance that's more likely to get a decision in the court. It's a horrible thing to think about, but that's true. If you have a lot of physical evidence, then it's more likely to get a conviction in court. So if then there's not a lot of physical evidence and there's only psychological evidence and there's only the evidence of the person who's telling their story about how they were victimised, then it's going to be really hard to convince a jury that the victimisation has actually happened, because that's what you have to do. You have to prove it. So often they'll decide not to push ahead those cases because they know that it might be dismissed for not having enough physical evidence, for example, or that they might go through the whole process and find that the person will be acquitted. Now, it's a financial burden on the system, which really shouldn't be consequential at all. It shouldn't be a thing to consider, but it is something that they consider. But most importantly, they consider the impact that that's going to have on the victim. So if it goes through the court and there is no physical evidence and they don't see a conviction at the end of that process, they will often make the decision not to put it through the court, because that might be 5 less times that the victim needs to tell their story. Now, the victims don't often see it this way, and they might sit there and go, well, I don't think that's fair. I wanted an outcome in court. This is what I've been waiting for. This is why I reported this. So they will often feel that secondary victimisation that I was talking about before, simply because they didn't get their day in court. So this is a real clincher, this issue. Okay, on the opposite side of that, we have the very rare occasion, and I will say it's very, very rare, where victims lie about being victimised. Again, this is quite common around very personal victimisations such as domestic violence and sexual assault. It's probably most common in those crime types, but it's not a common thing that happens. In fact, it's more likely to be that the police make assumptions about whether or not the person, that it's a revenge attack or whatever, and that they dismiss the person's complaint on that basis, where they just think, they've done it before, they've lied before, so we're not going to believe you this time, whereas in fact this may be a real case of victimisation. But there are circumstances where people come to the police station, they make a complaint against somebody to get back at them for whatever reason that might be, but it's very rare. I need to really stress that, because police think that some police can become quite cynical, and they can think, oh, well, it's really common for women to come down and, say horrible things around sexual assault crimes or whatever it might be, because they want to get back at their partners for having an affair. That just does not happen very often at all. It's very, very rare that it happens. Okay. So yeah, ultimately, it makes police very wary about whether or not they've got the evidence to build their cases. And if it's just someone's word against somebody else's, it's very unlikely to go ahead, particularly in the case of sexual assault. Sometimes police use inappropriate language or actions with different types of victims, and use inappropriate ways of measuring whether or not they've got evidence to support their crime. So inappropriate language, it's a no-brainer. If we think about the interviews that I've done with young people, I've had Indigenous young people who've said that police call them dogs. I've had Muslim young people who said police have said, go back to where you came from. I've had gay young people who have said that police have said to them, one young person got thrown into the back of a police car, driven around in the back of the panel van, the van that they have, paddy wagon, as they call it, and they sang Britney Spears songs at him for 2 hours, calling him a faggot and poof and all of this sort of stuff. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about inappropriate language. Police can also use actions and stuff or body language that don't appear to be as warm or rapport building as people expect. So a person might think, well, police officers might be friendly, blah, 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 blah. Chances are you're the, 1,000th person that they have breath tested that night. They don't really give a shit about being happy right now. They just want to get rid of you so that they can end their shift and go home. They're not going to be happy and all of that sort of stuff. They're just going to be, I'm officer such and such here doing my job. This is what's going to happen. Please breathe into the bag. Thank you very much. Have a good night. So they might not sound happy at all, even though they're just going through the process. So sometimes the way that police interact with people, it's not necessarily about inappropriate language, but it can be the bodily actions and the way that they go through the process is a very process-driven thing that people it can get victims offside sometimes, depending on what it is. So a couple of examples. One of the young people that I spoke to in my research was being homophobically abused by a member of the public. They then walked across to a police officer who, to get some support from that officer, to get the member of the public, to stop saying those things. And the police officer just said to him, just said straight to his face, well, if you didn't dress like that, then it wouldn't be a problem. Because he was a trans young person and who identified as female, but had physical characteristics that were quite masculine. So there was a dissonance there between the way that the way that she identified and the physical characteristics that were part of their bodily presentation. So that's clearly really inappropriate use of language for that young person in that particular time, because they were seeking support as a victim, not necessarily of a crime, but certainly something yucky was happening to them, and the officer has responded in a really inappropriate manner. Another example which came out of research from around the 2000s around rape and sexual assault victims, sorry, I talk about this a lot because I know heaps about it, was where police officers in the past would make rape victims sit on really hard wooden chairs and would extend their period of questioning of that rape victim over many, many hours in order to test their resilience to sitting on that chair. Because in their minds, they thought, well, if she's being raped as bad as she says she does, it'll be really uncomfortable to sit on that chair for that amount of time. If they show discomfort or measures of pain, then that is a sign that there is evidence of sexual assault. Disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. That stuff should not happen. Just should not happen. So, yeah, the credibility of the victim, all of those types of things can really impact on the way that a person experiences police in those processes. Sometimes police make assumptions about who is the victim in a circumstance, and this is very, very common in circumstances around domestic violence. In the past, we've only thought about domestic and intimate partner violence as being between a man and a woman, right? And very often, if I said to you, so who typically would be the victim? It would be the woman that you'd think of, and who is the man? He's the perpetrator, obviously. And that message has been reinforced year after year after year in advertising campaigns. So we instinctively think of domestic violence victims as women and perpetrators as men. And all the programs that we've written, and rightfully so, the statistics support that circumstance, but the programs written just work through those gendered notions of that relationship. So police can make assumptions about whether or not the perpetrator is a male or a female, and they will often make assumptions about the fact that, well, the perpetrator must be a male. In some instances, they have actually arrested men, and then they've got them back to the stations and interviewed them and found that they were actually the person that called the police to have their partner removed because they were being violent towards them. It's really quite extraordinary, but that has happened quite a bit. Then there's other circumstances where police make assumptions based on how the person looks and whether or not they're the victim. This is very common with same-sex intimate partner violence, which is why I wanted to raise it. Police look at the perpetrators, so it might be two lesbian women, and one of those women has called the police and they're not quite sure which one has. One of them looks more butch, the other one looks quite feminine, or femme as they call them. And this particular research project found that police made assumptions about who the perpetrator was based on whether or not someone looked more masculine, so the butch person, for instance. Noticeable differences in size, those types of things were how they measured who the victim was, as opposed to separating the two and then asking a series of questions. So that can make a victim of crime, particularly intimate partner violence, very uncomfortable, and it makes it really difficult for them. Other situations, we find police don't respond appropriately when a victim requests support. So there's a whole range of different types of experiences in this that I could recount. So for instance, oh my gosh, there was a really famous case in the UK where a woman was repeatedly calling police about her partner when her partner wasn't there. And, you know, she'd say things like, I really need your help. He's going to kill me. Can you please help me? I think she was being stalked by him. He was a former partner. He's going to kill me. Can you please help me? Blah, blah, blah. She went down to the police station a few times. But the bottom line is she did that at those points where the partner wasn't there. So the police would say things like when she called 999 or whatever it is, so is he there now? And she'd say no. And the police would say things like, well, there's nothing really we can do. We'll just wait and see what happens. This has gone on fire. That happened for a long period of time. Then the person went around there and then eventually killed her as a result of that. So the police response to those circumstances really matters. And when they don't respond appropriately, people die. I could rattle off a number of cases like that in Australia as well. Another one, which just emerged out of a recent project that I was involved in around LGBTI police liaison officers, was where the male partner had called about violence being perpetrated against him from his male partner, so it's a same-sex couple. The police have arrived. There's broken stuff all over the front lawn. There's glass everywhere. The car has been systematically destroyed by this partner with various things that he's been, attacking the car with. So it's in a bit of a state. But one of the things that the partner did was took the sex toys that they owned and threw them through the windows out onto the front lawn. And as soon as the police arrived, the person who was the victim in this case was standing out on the front lawn trying to shelter. And the police officers, instead of, making sure that the victim was okay, started asking questions about the sex toys. And asking questions like, well, how do you use this? What do you use this for? Blah, 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 blah. And the person said in the interview, although that's fine, I don't mind educating police, which realistically is quite generous of him because it's not his job. It's not appropriate. I just wanted the violence to stop. That was his exact words in the interview. So where they respond in a certain way is pretty important for us to take notice of. Okay, sometimes victims don't actually want any help from the police, regardless of how much you might want to help them. So a bit of an example, obviously, domestic violence and intimate partner violence moments, there's very, very common processes where the woman will call them out because she's being threatened, and later on she changes her mind and she doesn't want to press charges. And of course, that's very typically where we see murders of intimate partners happening. But there's other circumstances like this where a couple contacted a liaison officer about an assault at Mardi Gras. The officer really wanted them to press charges against the people because they had substantial evidence and so forth, but they called for a number of days and the people just didn't want to report. So sometimes even the best efforts of police work can't get those people to engage in the criminal justice system for whatever reason that might be. Sometimes victims don't seek police out because they know their experience is not a crime. Interestingly enough, this is a very common discussion around domestic violence where women actually don't recognise, and in fact men particularly don't recognise what is happening to them is actually a form of domestic violence. And we can see on this slide here the fabulous stereotype about women as victims of domestic violence being reinforced in this particular image. But yeah, there's very common circumstances where the police are aware of what's going on and they will say to them, well, actually, this is domestic violence. And the people will say, no, it's fine. Everything will be fine. I love him, blah, blah, blah. Or I love her, blah, blah, blah. Another circumstance where this happens quite a lot is online fraud. And the police are noticing, because they have a monitoring system now where they monitor the movement of money between bank accounts across international borders, and they're looking at $250,000 coming out in quite consistent payments from certain areas to other people, and they can immediately pick that up usually as online fraud, where that person is a victim of online fraud but they don't know it. They just think they're sending money back to a family member, or they're sending money back to a partner who they love and adore, whatever it might be. So the police go around to their house and say, did you know that you are being victimised as a form of online fraud? We know who these people are. We're trying to apprehend them at the moment. And they just don't believe them. They can send letters. They can turn up at their house. And these people just will not believe them. And they will continue to send enormous amounts of money to criminals in another country. And it's funny, we talk about Nigeria and so forth as being the most common places where this happens, but it's actually not the case. That's certainly part of it, but it's Russia. Russia seems to have quite a large number of people involved in these types of crime. Romance fraud and stuff is also very similar in that respect, where they create a very strong bond with the person and they're in love with the person and they genuinely don't want to believe this person is defrauding them. So sometimes people just don't know that their experience is a crime, and that they don't actually they don't follow up on it because of that reason. Verbal incidents of homophobia is quite a common one as well. So that might be that they experience a whole bunch of those incidents, might be 50 or 60 over a few months. It could be it's not considered a crime, so they don't go and report it to police, but it's a form of, the police, if you go into the police and talk to the police about that, they would be able to use that intelligence to say, something's amiss here and we need to do something about it. So they might actually follow up, even if the person's not involved in, crime reporting as such. But there's also circumstances where neighbourhood harassment, in the opposite side, the victims can see that this is actually a problem and that it's accelerating and it's making their lives a living hell. But the police don't have any way of consistently recording those issues at the other end. So the person, every time they ring and say, such and such has just vandalised my car, such and such has just thrown this through my window, such and such has just spat on me, it's kicked my dog and injured it. All of these different types of things are different forms of crime, but the police don't record it in a manner where it builds up over time and it demonstrates a profile of ongoing offending. And the poor person, I interviewed one guy who had, I think it was more than 40 reports in 1 year to police, and he had to tell the entire story 40 times. Like, that is seriously disturbing stuff. Okay. Sometimes victims cannot access police when they need to, and this needs to be immediate. One of the things the research has shown, that you've got 5 minutes for someone to report a crime of significance. It depends on the level and seriousness of crime, of course, but usually within 5 minutes, if they haven't got onto somebody, they just won't bother. They'll just hang up and they won't bother. So that's something that is fairly substantial for us to consider. I went and I visited the hate crime reporting charity in London called Gallup, GALOP, if you're interested. And they talked about how they would have people ring them and report anonymously, and they would say, I've been trying to get this liaison officer for about 20 minutes. I can't be bothered anymore, so I'm just ringing you guys to let you know that this has happened. That's a very, very common experience for some victims. And some victims have real trust issues, as we mentioned around in the first discussion that I talked about. They have very bad police experiences in the past, and therefore they don't trust police at all in the present. There are no circumstances where they would go forward to police and actually report a crime. And I've heard young people who have been subject to severe sexual assaults who have said, all they do is harass me on the street. All they do is pull me up and ask me for my details. Why on earth would I go and trust them with information about this crime? So they don't report it. And people go out and they go on to reoffend over and over and over and over again because that particular community will not report to the police because they've had bad experiences. So even those tiny little things where the police officers are not friendly, that they're using the wrong type of language, that they're not being respectful, just things like, they've got their license there and they're going, well, mate, your license clearly says that you're male, but you're dressed in a female costume. What is the deal with that? Clearly you're lying to us. You couldn't possibly be a female because your license says you are a male. Circumstances like that, you can guarantee that person will never go to the police if they are victimised. And that's a really serious thing, because if it means that other people are going to be victimised repeatedly, then that's a big problem for us. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. It's just taking you through a few of the major issues that we have around the nexus between policing and victims. And I hope that gives you some insights into how complex this area can actually be. Anyway, that's it from me. Have a great week, and I'll see you all soon. See ya!